The raging waters of the Red River swept over the tilting wagon like a beast claiming its prey, and Della Jennings clung to a splintered beam, her heart thumping wildly as her children's screams pierced the air. "Mama!" 6-year-old Samuel cried, his small fingers slipping from the edge of the overturned vehicle. The spring of 1875 had brought unexpected flooding to the Texas territory, turning what should have been a simple river crossing into a nightmare that threatened to steal everything Della held dear. Della had left St. Louis 3 weeks earlier following her husband's death from tuberculosis, determined to reach her sister's homestead near Llano, Texas. With 3 children and what remained of their belongings, she had made the journey despite warnings about traveling alone. Now, as the muddy waters churned around them, those warnings echoed in her mind. "Hold on, Sammy," she screamed, trying to reach for her son while keeping her other arm locked around 4-year-old Elizabeth. 8-year-old William had already been swept 10 feet downstream, clinging to a floating barrel, his terrified eyes locked on his mother. The current pulled harder. Elizabeth's small arms tightened around Della's neck as the water rose to their chins. "I can't hold on, Mama," Samuel whimpered, his fingers whitening against the wood. Just as Samuel's grip failed, a splash erupted nearby. A tall figure on horseback had ridden directly into the river, abandoning his mount at the bank to swim toward them. Della caught a glimpse of determined blue eyes beneath a soaked hat brim as the stranger reached Samuel just as the boy slipped beneath the surface. "I've got him, madam," the man called, his voice steady despite the roaring waters. He lifted Samuel with one powerful arm while using the other to navigate the current. "Hold tight to your daughter," Della nodded, unable to speak through her terror. The stranger, a cowboy by the look of his now sodden attire, placed Samuel on a relatively stable portion of the overturned wagon before diving back into the water toward William. The minutes that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. The cowboy moved with surprising efficiency, securing William from his precarious position on the barrel and swimming him to safety before returning for Della and Elizabeth. His strong arms wrapped around them both, guiding them through the treacherous waters to the shore where her other children waited, shivering and crying. Once on solid ground, Della collapsed to her knees, gathering her children close, their soaked clothes mingling with her own as she whispered prayers of gratitude. Only then did she truly look at their rescuer. Water streamed from his tall frame, dark blonde hair plastered to his forehead. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a face weathered by sun and wind. Despite having just battled a raging river, his blue eyes remained calm as he knelt beside them. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "No," Della managed, though her voice trembled. "Thanks to you, you saved my children. You saved all of us." He shook his head modestly. "Name's Daniel Dawson. Was heading to Llano myself when I heard the screaming." He glanced at the ruined wagon, now breaking apart in the current. "Looks like you've lost most everything." Della nodded, the full weight of their situation settling upon her shoulders. They were miles from Llano with no transportation, no supplies, and only the clothes on their backs. Her children shivered against her, and she fought back tears of desperation. "We'll be all right," she said, more for her children's benefit than from any real conviction. Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, removing his leather vest and draping it over Elizabeth's tiny shoulders. "My camp's just over that ridge," he said, pointing to a nearby hill. "Got a fire going and some dry blankets. You and your little ones are welcome to warm up there while we figure out what's next." Della hesitated. Her husband Thomas had warned her about the dangers of trusting strangers in the frontier, but this man had already risked his life to save her family. What choice did she have? "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she said finally. "I'm Della Jennings. These are my children William, Samuel, and Elizabeth." Daniel nodded respectfully to each child before whistling for his horse, which had remained at the riverbank during the rescue. The large chestnut gelding trotted over, and Daniel lifted Elizabeth onto the saddle, then Samuel behind her. "William can ride with me," he said, "and I'll walk alongside you, Mrs. Jennings, if that's agreeable." As they made their way toward his camp, Della noticed Daniel subtly slowing his pace to match hers, despite his obvious physical strength and longer stride. His consideration touched something inside her that had been dormant since Thomas fell ill. The camp was simple but well organized: a small tent, a crackling fire, and supplies carefully arranged. Daniel immediately set to work, pulling dry blankets from his pack and passing them around before adding wood to build up the fire. "I've got some coffee and beans," he said, hanging a pot over the flames. "Not much of a feast, but it'll warm you up." As the children huddled by the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled of leather and pine, Della found her voice again. "You said you were headed to Lano," Daniel nodded, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "Yes, madam, got some business there." "That's where we're going too," she explained. "My sister Martha has a small farm outside town. After my husband passed, I sold our home in St. Louis to join her." Daniel's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jennings." "Thank you," she whispered, watching as he efficiently prepared the simple meal. His hands were large but moved with surprising grace. "May I ask what business takes you to Lano?" "Cattle," he replied. "I've been hired to help drive a herd from Lano to Kansas. Supposed to meet up with the outfit tomorrow." He paused, looking at the children who were beginning to doze by the fire. "But I reckon they can wait an extra day." "Oh no," Della protested. "We couldn't impose, Mrs. Jennings," Daniel interrupted gently. "Your wagon's gone, along with your provisions. You've got 3 young ones, and we're still a good 15 miles from Lano. It's no imposition to see you safely there." The simple kindness in his words made her throat tighten. She had been so focused on maintaining her strength for her children that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else shoulder some of the burden. That night, Daniel insisted Della and the children take the tent while he slept outside by the fire. Della lay awake for hours, listening to her children's steady breathing and trying to comprehend how completely their circumstances had changed in a single day. Outside, she could hear Daniel occasionally stirring, adding wood to keep the fire burning through the night. Morning brought clearer skies and the chance to properly assess their situation. In daylight, Della could see that Daniel was perhaps 28 or 29, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His movements were efficient, his manner direct yet kind. "I've been thinking," he said over breakfast biscuits he'd somehow managed to make in a small skillet. "My horse can't carry all of us to Lano, but there's a small settlement about 5 miles east. Might be able to find a wagon there to hire." William, who had been quietly observing the cowboy all morning, finally spoke up. "Are you a real cowboy, Mr. Dawson?" Daniel's smile transformed his face, erasing the weathered lines around his eyes. "Suppose I am, young man. Been working cattle since I was hardly older than you." "My pa said cowboys are rough men," William continued, ignoring his mother's warning glance. "But you don't seem rough." Daniel chuckled, not offended in the slightest. "Some are, that's true enough. But most are just working men trying to make their way, same as anybody." As they prepared to leave camp, Della watched Daniel with her children. He showed infinite patience answering William's endless questions about horses and cattle drives. gently helped Elizabeth tie her shoes, and slipped Samuel an extra biscuit when he thought Della wasn't looking. They walked for nearly 2 hours, Daniel leading his horse with Elizabeth and Samuel taking turns riding. Before reaching the settlement, he'd mentioned little more than a collection of rough buildings that included a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of homes. The storekeeper, a wiry man named Jenkins, shook his head when Daniel inquired about a wagon. "Ain't got none to spare, especially after that flood. Took out Simmons Bridge, too. Heard a family got caught in it yesterday. That would be us," Della interjected quietly. Jenkins looked her up and down, taking in her still damp dress and the 3 children. His expression softened slightly. "Well, you're lucky to be alive, madam." "Thanks to Mr. Dawson," she replied, glancing at Daniel, who was examining a wall of tools with studied interest, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. After further discussion, the blacksmith offered them the use of a small cart that could be hitched to Daniel's horse. It wasn't much, but it would carry the children and what few supplies Daniel purchased from Jenkins' store: basic foodstuffs, a blanket for each of them, and a change of clothes for Della that Jenkins' wife provided from her own wardrobe. "Can't have you arriving in Lano looking like you've been dragged through the river, though that's the truth of it," the woman said kindly. When Della tried to promise payment once they reached her sister's farm, Daniel quietly settled the bill himself, waving away her protests. "Consider it an advance on your sister's hospitality when we get there," he said. "I'll be needing a good meal before I join that cattle drive." Back on the trail, with the children more comfortable in the cart, Della walked alongside Daniel. The spring sun warmed their faces as they traveled, and she found herself studying his profile when he wasn't looking: the straight nose, the firm jaw with its day-old stubble, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners even when he wasn't smiling. "You never mentioned where you're from originally, Mr. Dawson," she said as they crossed a stretch of open prairie. "All over, I suppose," he replied. "Born in Tennessee, but my family moved to Missouri when I was young. After the war, I came south, found work with the cattle outfits. Been doing that ever since." "The war," she repeated softly. "He would have been just old enough to fight." "Did you serve?" He nodded once, his expression closing slightly. "Confederate cavalry, last 2 years. Not something I talk about much." Della understood his reticence. The war had left scars across the country that were still healing 10 years later. "My husband was too ill to serve," she offered. "Consumption had already taken hold before the fighting started." Daniel glanced at her. "Must have been a long struggle for him. And for you." The simple acknowledgement of what she had endured as Thomas slowly wasted away brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, not wanting the children to see. "Yes, it was. But he was a good man and a wonderful father. The children miss him terribly." "They seem like fine children," Daniel said. "You've done well by them." Before Della could respond, Samuel called from the cart, pointing excitedly at a jackrabbit bounding across the prairie. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them: a mutual recognition of past hardships endured. They made camp that evening by a small creek, having covered nearly 10 miles. Daniel proved remarkably resourceful, fashioning a lean-to from branches and the canvas he normally used for his bedroll, giving Della and the children shelter for the night. After a simple supper of beans and biscuits, Daniel produced a harmonica from his pocket. The children gathered around as he played a gentle tune, the notes floating into the darkening sky. Elizabeth fell asleep against Della's shoulder, lulled by the music and exhaustion. When the children were settled for the night, Della found Daniel sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She sat nearby, drawing her shawl around her shoulders against the night's chill. "Thank you," she said simply. not just for the rescue but for all of this. Most men would have continued on their way once we were safely ashore. Daniel poked at the fire with a stick. Most wouldn't, he disagreed. Not with children involved. Besides, Leno's my destination too. Makes sense to travel together. His modesty was refreshing after the overbearing personalities she'd encountered in St. Louis following Thomas's death, men who saw a widow with property as an opportunity rather than a person in mourning. Still, she persisted, you've delayed your own journey, spent your own money on our behalf. I insist on repaying you when we reach my sister's farm. Daniel looked up then, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Mrs. Jennings, helping folks in need isn't something that requires repayment. Della, she said suddenly. Please call me Della. After all we've been through, Mrs. Jennings seems overly formal. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Della then, and I'm Daniel. They talked quietly as the fire burned down, sharing the kind of personal details that often emerge more easily in darkness. She learned that he had no family left, parents both gone, a brother killed at Shiloh. He was 29, had never married, and had spent most of the past decade moving with the seasons and the cattle. In turn, she told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, meeting Thomas at church when she was 18. Their move to St. Louis where he'd worked as a clerk until his illness made it impossible. She spoke of her determination to give her children a better life after his death, of the letters from her sister describing the opportunities in Texas. It's a hard country, Daniel warned. Different from what you're used to. I'm stronger than I look, she replied with a touch of defiance. Daniel's gaze traveled over her not in an improper way, but as if truly seeing her for the first time. I don't doubt that at all. The next morning dawned clear, promising good traveling weather. Daniel estimated they would reach Leno by late afternoon. As they journeyed, Della noticed William walking alongside Daniel, imitating his stride and the way he carried himself. The boy had said little since his father's death, but now he peppered Daniel with questions about horses, cattle, and life on the trail. For his part, Daniel answered with patience and attention, occasionally resting his hand on William's shoulder in a gesture that made Della's heart ache. It had been so long since her son had a male figure to look up to. Around midday, they stopped to rest near a small pond. While the children explored the shoreline under Della's watchful eye, Daniel disappeared briefly, returning with a string of small fish he'd caught using a line and hook from his pack. Thought we might have something besides beans for lunch, he said with a grin that transformed his usual serious expression. They built a small fire, and Daniel showed William how to clean the fish. Della watched her son's face light up with pride when Daniel praised his careful work. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight, not just gratitude for Daniel's kindness, but something deeper she wasn't ready to examine. As they ate, Elizabeth sat beside Daniel, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the leather of his vest, as if reassuring herself he was real. Samuel had overcome his initial shyness and now regaled Daniel with stories about their cat in St. Louis, embellishing wildly about its size and hunting prowess. "This cat of yours," Daniel said seriously, "sounds more like a mountain lion than a house cat." Samuel giggled, delighted by the teasing. "No, he was just a regular cat, but Papa said he was the best mouser in all of Missouri." It was the first time any of the children had mentioned Thomas without tears, and Della caught Daniel's eye over Samuel's head. He gave her a small nod, understanding the significance of the moment. By mid-afternoon, they began to see signs of settlement-fenced fields, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. Daniel pointed out landmarks, familiarizing Della with the territory that would be her new home. "Your sister's place should be about 2 miles north of town," he said. From what you've described, it sounds like the old Peterson homestead. Good land, if you don't mind some hard work. After the past 3 years nursing Thomas, hard work outside in the fresh air sounds like heaven, Della admitted. Daniel studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected when I first saw you in that river. Oh, and what did you expect? I'm not sure, he said thoughtfully, but not someone so. So what? She prompted when he didn't continue. He seemed to choose his words carefully. Not someone so determined, so resilient. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. She reminded herself that in another day or two, Daniel would be gone, continuing on to his cattle drive, while she began her new life in Leno. Their paths had crossed by chance, a fortunate chance that had saved her family, but chance nonetheless. As they crested a small rise, the town of Leno came into view, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with a church steeple rising above the rest. Beyond the town, the landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with oak trees and the occasional homestead. There it is, Daniel said. Not much compared to St. Louis, I expect. Della shook her head. It looks perfect. They entered the town slowly, attracting curious glances from the locals. Della was acutely aware of her appearance, the borrowed dress, her hair hastily braided, the children disheveled despite her best efforts to tidy them that morning. She held her head high nonetheless. Daniel guided them to the general store, where he inquired about Martha Jenkins' farm. The storekeeper, a round-faced man named Billings, looked surprised. "Martha's expecting you," he asked Della. "Heard nothing about it, and news travels fast here." A cold feeling settled in Della's stomach. "I wrote to her weeks ago. We've been corresponding for months about my coming to join her after my husband's passing." Billings exchanged a glance with his wife, who had emerged from the back of the store. The woman stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Jennings, is it?" When Della nodded, she continued gently. "I'm afraid there's been no mail delivery to Martha's place for nearly a month now. She took ill with pneumonia right after the last cold spell. She's been staying with us in town while she recovers." "Ill," Della repeated, her voice faint. "But is she all right?" "She's on the mend," Mrs. Billings assured her. "But she's in no condition to receive visitors, much less family coming to stay. The doctor says she needs another few weeks of complete rest." Della felt the room tilt slightly. All her careful plans, the last of her money spent on the journey, the wagon and supplies now lost to the river, and now her sister couldn't even receive them. She felt Daniel's steady presence beside her, a hand lightly touching her elbow to steady her. "Is there a boarding house?" he asked Billings. "Somewhere Mrs. Jennings and her children can stay until her sister recovers. Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable place 2 doors down," Billings replied. "But—" he glanced at Della's worn appearance and the children's tired faces, clearly wondering about her ability to pay. "I have some money," Della said quickly, though the small amount sewn into the hem of her petticoat wouldn't last long. "Mrs. Jennings lost everything in the river crossing yesterday," Daniel explained to the storekeeper. "I was fortunate enough to be passing by and help them to shore, but her wagon and all their possessions were swept away." Mrs. Billings clucked sympathetically. "You poor dears, what a terrible welcome to Leno." She turned to her husband. "John, Martha would want us to help her sister. We can advance her some credit at the store at least." Of course," Billings agreed. "And I'll speak to Mrs. Holloway about the boarding house. Given the circumstances, I'm sure she'll be amenable to an arrangement." Relief flooded through Della, though it was tempered by concern for her sister and uncertainty about their future. She squeezed the children closer to her sides, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Thank you," she said to the Billingses. "Your kindness means more than I can say." As arrangements were being discussed, Daniel stepped outside, returning a few minutes later with a tall, gray-haired man he introduced as Mr. Peterson, the ranch owner who'd hired him for the cattle drive. "Explained your situation to Mr. Peterson," Daniel said. "He's got a proposition for you." Peterson removed his hat, revealing a deeply tanned, weathered face. "Mrs. Jennings, I understand you're in a difficult spot. Daniel here tells me you were planning to help your sister run her farm." "That's right," Della confirmed. "I've had some experience gardening, and I'm a quick learner." Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "My wife passed on 2 years back, and I've been running the house and the ranch with just my daughter's help. She's getting married next month, moving to her husband's place near Austin." He cleared his throat. "We've got a small cabin on the property, nothing fancy, mind you, but sound and clean. Used to be the foreman's place before he built his own house. You and your children would be welcome to stay there while your sister recovers. In exchange, perhaps you could help with the cooking for the men during the cattle drive preparations. After that, we could discuss a more permanent arrangement if it suits both of us." Della stared at him, hardly daring to believe this stroke of good fortune. "That's extraordinarily generous, Mr. Peterson." "Not generosity, madam, practicality. I need help, you need a place to stay, and any friend of Daniel's is welcome at the Peterson Ranch." Della glanced at Daniel, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Daniel seems to think you're a woman of substance," Peterson continued. "That's good enough for me." After further discussion, it was arranged that Della and the children would accompany Daniel to the Peterson Ranch the following morning. Mrs. Billings insisted they stay the night in the rooms above the store, and even produced clean clothing for all of them from her stock. "Consider it a loan until you get on your feet," she said firmly, when Della tried to protest. "Martha would never forgive me if I didn't look after her sister properly." That evening, after the children were bathed and tucked into real beds for the first time in weeks, Della found herself sitting on the small porch behind the store, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The door opened and Daniel stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering her one. "Mrs. Billings said to tell you the children are sleeping soundly. Thank you." She accepted the cup gratefully, for the coffee and for everything else. "I don't know what we would have done without your help today." Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his tall frame silhouetted against the evening sky. "Peterson's a good man. You and the children will be safe there. Will you be staying?" The question escaped before she could consider it fully. "I mean, after the cattle drive preparations. I'll be going north with the herd," he replied. "That's been the plan." "Of course," she said quickly, embarrassed by her presumption. "I just thought." "The children have grown quite attached to you." Daniel was silent for a moment, looking out at the gathering darkness. "It's been good for William having a man to talk to. Boy his age needs that." "Yes," Della agreed softly. "He's changed just in these few days, become more himself again." "He's got his father's strength in him," Daniel observed. "You can see it in how he watches out for the little ones." The fact that Daniel had noticed this about her son, something Thomas had often said before he became ill, touched Della deeply. "You're very perceptive, Daniel Dawson." He shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed. "When you spend as much time as I do watching cattle for signs of trouble, you get in the habit of noticing things." They fell into a companionable silence, drinking their coffee as the night settled around them. Della found herself wishing the moment wouldn't end, that they could simply remain on this porch indefinitely, with her children sleeping safely nearby and this steady, quiet man beside her. "I should check on the horse," Daniel said eventually, straightening up. "Make sure everything's ready for tomorrow." "Daniel," Della said impulsively as he turned to go. "I know I keep saying it, but thank you, not just for saving us from the river, but for for showing my children that there are still good men in the world." In the dim light from the store windows, she saw something flicker across his face, a vulnerability he quickly masked. "Good night, Della," he said gently. "Try to get some rest." The journey to the Peterson ranch the next morning took less than an hour. Della and the children rode in a wagon provided by Peterson, while Daniel rode alongside on his horse. As they traveled, Della tried to memorize the landmarks, determined to learn her way around this new territory. The ranch itself was impressive, a sprawling main house built of sturdy timber, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and beyond, pastures dotted with cattle. Men moved purposefully around the property, preparing for the upcoming drive. Peterson's daughter, Abigail, greeted them warmly, showing Della to the cabin that would be their home. Though small, it was clean and well built, with 2 rooms, a small cook stove, and simple furniture. Through the single window, Della could see a vegetable garden that had been recently tended. "I've been keeping it up," Abigail explained, "but I'll be leaving soon. It would be wonderful if you could take it over." "I'd be happy to," Della assured her. "I've always enjoyed gardening." While the children explored their new surroundings under Abigail's watchful eye, Della was introduced to the ranch cook, a grizzled old man named Hank who seemed relieved at the prospect of female assistance. "Been cooking for these cowboys too long," he grumbled good-naturedly. "They'll eat anything, no matter how bad it tastes. Lost my standards, I have." By midday, Della had rolled up her sleeves and begun work in the ranch kitchen, helping prepare the noon meal for the hands. She caught glimpses of Daniel throughout the day as he worked with the horses, his skill evident even to her untrained eye. That evening, after the children were settled in their new home, Della sat on the cabin's small porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Footsteps approached, and she looked up to see Daniel carrying a small crate. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting it down. "Just some basics: lamp oil, matches, coffee. Peterson said to tell you breakfast is at 5 for the hands, but you're welcome at the main house anytime." "Thank you," she said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" He hesitated briefly before joining her. In the fading light, with his hat pushed back on his head and his features relaxed, he looked younger, less weathered by his hard life. "The children are thrilled with the cabin," she told him. "Elizabeth has already claimed a corner for her dolls, which Mrs. Billings kindly provided, and the boys are planning expeditions to explore the ranch tomorrow." Daniel smiled. "Peterson's a fair employer. He'll let the boys tag along with some of the less dangerous work if they're interested." "Good way for them to learn. William would love that," Della said. "He's already talking about becoming a cowboy thanks to your influence." "Could do worse," Daniel remarked. "Honest work, at least." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Della gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "How long will you be gone on the cattle drive?" 3 months, give or take," he replied. "Depends on the weather, the cattle, 100 other things." 3 months seemed an eternity. Della was surprised by the sharp pang of disappointment she felt. "The children will miss you." Daniel turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Just the children." The directness of his question and the implication behind it made her breath catch. She had been a respectable widow, focused entirely on her children's welfare. She had not allowed herself to consider any other possibilities, especially not with a man she'd known for mere days. And yet, there was something about Daniel Dawson that spoke to her in a way no one ever had, not even Thomas in their earliest days together. A steadiness, a quiet strength that drew her like a beacon. "I believe I might miss you as well," she admitted softly. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "After the drive, I could come back through Lano, check on you and the children, make sure you're settling in all right." "I'd like that," Della replied, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. "I can't offer much," Daniel continued, his voice lower now. "Never stayed in one place long enough to build anything lasting, but meeting you and your children makes me wonder if maybe it's time I did." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. This was not a practiced declaration or a hasty decision, but the considered thought of a man who chose his words with care. "3 months is a long time," she said. "Perhaps we should both use it to consider what we want for our futures." Daniel's expression softened into a smile that transformed his entire face. "That sounds like wisdom, Della Jennings." Before either could say more, William appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mama, I'm thirsty." The moment broken, Daniel stood. "I should let you tend to your family. Early start tomorrow." As he walked away into the gathering darkness, Della felt a curious mixture of emotions: anticipation, uncertainty, and something else she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Della and her children adapted to life on the Peterson ranch. The cabin became a true home, with small touches that reflected their personalities: wildflowers in jars on the table, William's collection of interesting rocks on the windowsill, Elizabeth's drawings pinned to the walls. Della threw herself into her work, proving herself invaluable in the kitchen as the cattle drive preparations intensified. She learned to cook for large groups of hungry men, mastering the art of hearty, filling meals that could be prepared in quantity. The children thrived in the open air and freedom of ranch life. William spent every possible moment with the cowboys, learning to ride a gentle pony Peterson provided and absorbing the basics of ranch work. Samuel discovered a talent for helping with the chickens and garden, while Elizabeth became the pet of the ranch, charming everyone from the gruffest hand to Peterson himself with her sunny disposition. Through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence. Though busy with preparations for the drive, he made time each day to check on Della and the children, sometimes joining them for an evening meal at the cabin or teaching William another aspect of horsemanship. Della found herself looking forward to these moments, storing away the memory of his smile or the sound of his laugh to revisit later. She noticed small things about him: the way he always removed his hat when entering the cabin, how he listened intently when her children spoke, the gentleness of his hands despite their strength and size. 2 weeks before the cattle drive was set to begin, Martha was finally well enough for visitors. Peterson provided a buggy, and Della took the children into town to meet their aunt for the first time. Martha was thinner than in Della's memory, her face pale but her eyes bright with the same determination Della herself possessed. The sisters embraced tearfully while the children hung back shyly. "Look at you," Martha said, holding Della at arm's length. "Already looking like a proper Texas woman. And these must be my beautiful niece and nephews." After introductions and the initial excitement, Martha explained that while she was improving, the doctor had advised against returning to the farm alone. "The pneumonia was quite severe," she admitted. "Dr. Miller says another winter alone out there could be dangerous if I were to fall ill again." "Then you must come stay with us at the Peterson ranch," Della decided. "The cabin is small, but we can make room." Martha shook her head. "I've been thinking about this since I heard you were staying there. My farm isn't large, 40 acres, mostly, but it's good land. I'm considering selling it and using the money to buy a small house here in town. Mrs. Billings mentioned that old Mr. Kramer wants to sell his place on Oak Street." "But your farm, I thought we would work it together," Della protested. Dreams change, sister, Martha said gently. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying what's truly important. I want to be close to people, to have neighbors who check on me, and you. She glanced meaningfully at Della, seemed to have found a good situation at the Peterson ranch. Mrs. Billings tells me there's a certain cowboy who's taken quite an interest in you and the children. Della felt her cheeks warm. Daniel has been very kind to us, she said carefully. He saved our lives at the river crossing. Martha's knowing smile indicated she suspected there was more to it than simple kindness. Well, I look forward to meeting this hero of yours. Will he be at the social on Saturday? Social, Della repeated. The spring dance at the church, Martha explained. It's the last big gathering before the cattle drives start. Everyone will be there. On the ride back to the ranch, Della pondered her sister's words. The thought of Martha selling her farm changed everything. Della had come to Texas expecting to help run that property, but now it seemed her future lay elsewhere. The realization was both unsettling and oddly freeing. When she mentioned the social to Daniel that evening, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset, he nodded thoughtfully. Peterson mentioned it. Traditional send-off before the drive start. He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. I thought I might ask if you'd allow me to escort you and the children. The formal phrasing made Della smile. We would be honored, Mr. Dawson. He looked up, catching her teasing tone, and the corner of his mouth lifted in response. Just thought it might be easier. Your first big town gathering and all. Folks can be curious about newcomers. Is that the only reason? Della asked, feeling uncharacteristically bold. Daniel held her gaze. No, he said simply. That's not the only reason. The admission hung between them, full of possibility. Since their conversation weeks earlier, neither had spoken directly about the growing connection between them, though it was evident in 100 small ways: the lingering glances, the way they naturally sought each other's company, the ease that had developed between them. Then we accept your escort, Della said softly, though I'm afraid I have nothing suitable to wear for dancing. I wouldn't worry about that, Daniel replied, standing to leave. Something tells me Abigail Peterson might have some ideas on that front. He was right. When Della mentioned the social the next day, Abigail's eyes lit up. Oh, you must come. It's the most wonderful event of the season. She looked Della up and down consideringly. I think we're of a size. I have several dresses that would suit you beautifully. True to her word, Abigail arrived at the cabin the following afternoon with an armload of dresses. Try them all, she insisted. We have to find the perfect one. After much deliberation and the children's enthusiastic input, Della settled on a gown of deep blue cotton, simply cut but with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It brings out the gold in your hair, Abigail declared. And those eyes of yours. Daniel Dawson won't know what hit him. Abigail, Della protested, but she couldn't help the flutter of anticipation at the thought of Daniel seeing her in something other than her practical work dresses. Saturday arrived clear and warm. Della spent the morning helping with regular chores before turning her attention to preparing herself and the children for the social. She washed her hair and let it dry in the sun, the honey-colored strands lightening with exposure. For the first time since Thomas's death, she took care with her appearance, not out of duty or propriety, but because she wanted to look beautiful. When Daniel arrived at the cabin to escort them to town, Della was just pinning the last strands of her hair into a simple but elegant arrangement Abigail had shown her. She opened the door to find him standing there in clean dark trousers and a new shirt, his hair still damp from washing, his hat held respectfully in his hands. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Della saw in his eyes the same appreciation she knew must be visible in her own. You look beautiful, he said finally, his voice lower than usual. Thank you, she replied softly. You're quite handsome yourself. The children burst into the moment, excited about the outing and dressed in their best clothes, recently purchased from Billings' store with Della's first earnings from the ranch. The town hall was transformed for the social, with paper lanterns hanging from the rafters and tables laden with food brought by every family in the community. A small group of musicians played in one corner, and couples were already dancing when Della's party arrived. Martha was there, seated with the Billingses but looking stronger than during their previous visit. She embraced Della warmly before turning her attention to Daniel. So you're the man who saved my sister and niece and nephews, she said, studying him with frank interest. I owe you a debt I can never repay. Daniel shook his head. No debt, madam. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Martha contradicted, and not as thoroughly. You've done more than save them from the river. You've helped them build a new life here. She looked between Daniel and Della with knowing eyes. I do hope we'll be seeing more of you after the cattle drive, Mr. Dawson. Before Daniel could respond, Peterson approached, claiming Martha's attention. The children quickly found playmates among the other ranch families, leaving Della and Daniel momentarily alone. Would you care to dance? He asked, offering his hand. Della hesitated only briefly. It had been years since she danced. Thomas had been too ill for such activities long before his death. I may be out of practice, she warned. That makes two of us, Daniel replied with a small smile. We can relearn together. His hand was warm and steady as he led her to the dance floor. As the music began, he placed his other hand lightly on her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between them. They moved awkwardly at first, but soon found a rhythm together, turning among the other couples. Everyone's watching us, Della murmured, noticing the curious glances from the townspeople. Let them, Daniel said simply. They're just trying to figure out how a man like me ended up dancing with the most beautiful woman in the room. The compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, warmed her from within. As they continued to dance, the space between them gradually diminished until she could feel the solid strength of him just inches away. When the music ended, Daniel didn't immediately release her hand. Would you mind stepping outside for a moment? He asked quietly. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Heart pounding, Della nodded. They slipped out the side door onto the small porch that ran along the building. The evening air was cool after the warmth of the dance floor, and Della drew her shawl closer around her shoulders. Daniel stood before her, more serious than she had ever seen him. I leave on the cattle drive in 10 days, he began. Yes, Della acknowledged, her throat suddenly tight. The children and I will miss you. Before I go, I wanted to be clear about my intentions, he continued. I'm not a man of many words, Della, but I want you to know that what I feel for you and your children is something I've never felt before. She remained silent, her heart racing as he gathered his thoughts. I know it's fast, he said. Too fast, maybe. You're still grieving your husband and you've only just arrived in Texas. But I also know that life doesn't always give us the luxury of perfect timing. He took a deep breath. When I return from the drive, if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly. With your permission and with respect for the memory of your husband. Of all the things Della had expected him to say, this formal, respectful request wasn't it. The consideration behind it, the acknowledgement of her loss and her need for time touched her deeply. Daniel, she said softly, in the short time we've known each other, you've shown me more consideration and kindness than most people show in a lifetime. Of course I'm willing. Relief crossed his features, followed by something that looked remarkably like joy. I don't have much to offer, he warned, Some savings, my skills with horses and cattle. It's not a fortune." "I don't need a fortune," Della replied. "My children and I need someone we can trust, someone who sees us as we are and values us for it. You've been that person from the moment you pulled us from that river." Daniel's hand reached out tentatively, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The gentle touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "Peterson offered me a permanent position after the drive, foreman of the horse operation. It would mean staying in one place, building something lasting." "You'd give up the trail for that?" Della asked, knowing what a significant change it would represent for him. "For the right reasons," he said meaningfully. "I'm not getting any younger, and the trail is a young man's game. Besides—" He paused, a smile touching his lips. "I've found some compelling reasons to consider putting down roots." Before she could respond, the door opened behind them and William burst onto the porch. "Mama, Mr. Peterson says they're about to cut the cake and Elizabeth is already in line." The moment broken, they returned to the social, but something fundamental had shifted between them. As they rejoined the celebration, Daniel's hand brushed against hers briefly, a promise of conversations to come. The remaining days before the cattle drive passed too quickly. Della and Daniel found moments together amid the busy preparations, sharing coffee on the cabin porch at dawn, walking back from the main house after dinner, occasionally riding out to check on a section of fence or a water source. They spoke of practical things, his plans for the position with Peterson, her ideas for expanding the garden, the children's adjustment to their new life. But beneath these everyday topics ran a current of deeper connection, a growing understanding of each other's character and values. The evening before his departure, Daniel came to the cabin after the children were asleep. Della had been expecting him, waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a lantern casting a warm glow around them. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" she asked as he settled into the chair beside her. "As ready as it can be," he replied. "Peterson's running a tight operation. Should be a good drive if the weather holds." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Daniel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you," he said, holding it out to her. "Just a small token to remember me by while I'm gone." Della unwrapped it carefully to find a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. "Daniel, it's beautiful," she breathed, opening the tiny clasp to find it empty inside. "Thought you might want to put a picture of the children in it," he explained. "Billings says there's a photographer coming through town next month. Will you help me put it on?" she asked, holding out the necklace and turning slightly. Daniel's fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the clasp at the back of her neck, his touch warm against her skin. When she turned back to face him, the locket resting just below her throat, their faces were closer than they had ever been. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, with exquisite gentleness, Daniel leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers, a kiss so light it was barely more than a whisper. Yet it sent a current of feeling through Della that left her breathless. He drew back slightly, his eyes searching hers for permission. Finding it, he kissed her again, more firmly this time, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Della felt tears gathering in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a complicated joy. This moment marked an ending and a beginning simultaneously, the final release of her past and the first step into a future she hadn't imagined possible. "I'll write," Daniel promised, his voice husky, "whenever we reach a town with a post office." "We'll be waiting," Della whispered, "all of us." The cattle drive departed at dawn the next morning. Della and the children stood with the other ranch families, watching as the massive herd began its slow journey northward, guided by the cowboys on horseback. Daniel rode near the front, his tall figure easily recognizable. Just before they passed out of sight, he turned in the saddle and raised his hat in a final salute. Della lifted her hand in return, the silver locket catching the early morning sun. "Will Mr. Daniel come back, Mama?" Elizabeth asked, her small hand clutching Della's skirt. "Yes, sweetheart," Della replied with certainty. "He's coming back to us." The weeks that followed were full of hard work and adjustment as Della established her place on the ranch. She took over management of the garden, expanding it to include vegetables she remembered from her Pennsylvania childhood. She learned to make soap and candles from the ranch supplies, skills that brought her satisfaction and saved Peterson money. Martha sold her farm as planned and purchased the small house in town, which quickly became a gathering place for the children on their weekly visits. The sisters grew close again after their years of separation, finding common ground in their shared determination and resilience. Daniel's letters arrived sporadically brief, but heartfelt accounts of the drive's progress, the weather, and occasional amusing anecdotes about the men or cattle. He always included special messages for each child and ended with increasingly tender words for Della herself. She read these letters aloud to the children, omitting only the most personal passages, which she saved to revisit in private moments. William, Samuel, and Elizabeth responded with their own letters and drawings, which Della sent to the towns ahead on the cattle drive's route. As promised, Peterson kept Daniel's job waiting and even expanded his responsibilities in anticipation of his return. "Man with his head on straight," Peterson commented to Della one evening as they discussed ranch operations. "Good with the stock, respected by the men, hard combination to find." Summer turned to early fall, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of Daniel's return. According to his last letter, the drive had been successful, the cattle delivered to the railroad in Kansas, and the men were making good time on the journey home. Della found herself counting the days, aware of a growing anticipation that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. The children, too, spoke constantly of Daniel's return, planning the things they would show him and tell him. Finally, on a crisp October afternoon, William came running from the main house where he'd been helping with chores. "Riders coming," he shouted. "Papa Daniel's back." Della's heart skipped at her son's unconscious use of the term "papa," but she had no time to dwell on it as she hurried outside, Samuel and Elizabeth close behind her. In the distance, a group of riders approached the ranch, dust rising from the horses' hooves. As they drew closer, Della shaded her eyes against the sun, searching for the familiar figure. They're taller than the others, riding slightly ahead was Daniel. Her heart seemed to swell in her chest at the sight of him. The children couldn't contain themselves, running toward the approaching riders with shouts of excitement. Daniel dismounted in one fluid motion and knelt to receive them, gathering all three in an embrace that spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. Della approached more slowly, drinking in the sight of him. He was thinner, his skin darkened further by months in the sun, but his eyes were the same clear blue as they found hers over the children's heads. When he stood to greet her, there was a moment of uncertainty, both aware of the watching cowboys and ranch hands. Then Daniel stepped forward, removing his hat. "Della," he said simply, his voice washing over her like a balm. "Welcome home," she replied, the words carrying more meaning than their simple sound. That evening, after the excitement of return had settled, and the children were finally asleep, exhausted from the day's celebrations, Daniel and Della sat once more on the cabin porch. The familiar setting highlighted how much had changed since their last evening together. "The children have grown," Daniel observed. "William's at least an inch taller." "They've thrived here," Della agreed. "This place has been good for all of us." Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I thought about you every day," he said quietly. "About all of you, never expected to miss anyone the way I miss this family." "We missed you too," Della whispered. "More than I can say." He turned to face her fully. "I've had a lot of time to think on the trail, Della, about what I want, what kind of life would have meaning." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent most of my years moving from place to place, never staying long enough to build anything lasting. But now, for the first time, I can see a different path." Della's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. "What do you see?" "A home," he said simply. "A family, a purpose beyond the next drive or the next paycheck." His fingers tightened around hers. "I see you, Della Jennings, and those children, and a life we could build together." The directness of his words took her breath away. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Daniel Dawson?" A smile touched his lips. "I believe I am, though perhaps not as eloquently as you deserve." He shifted, moving from the chair to kneel before her. "Della, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to be a father to your children, to build a life with you here?" Though she had anticipated this moment during the long weeks of his absence, the reality of it, this good man kneeling before her, offering his heart with such simple honesty, moved her beyond words. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. "Is that a yes?" Daniel asked, hope evident in his face. "Yes," Della managed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Daniel, nothing would make me happier." He rose then, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. This time, their kiss held no hesitation, only the promise of a shared future and a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Lano, with Peterson giving away the bride and Martha standing as her witness. William, Samuel, and Elizabeth participated in the ceremony, each pledging in their own words to welcome Daniel into their family. Peterson offered them the foreman's house on the ranch, larger than the cabin, with room for the family to grow. Daniel accepted the position as head of the horse operation, putting his skills to work building a breeding program that would eventually become renowned throughout the region. Della continued to expand the garden into a productive operation that supplied not only the ranch, but also provided excess produce to sell in town. Her practical knowledge combined with Daniel's understanding of the land created a partnership that benefited them both personally and professionally. As the years passed, the family grew. A son, Joseph, joined them the following summer, followed by twin girls, Catherine and Claire, 2 years later. The house expanded accordingly, with Daniel adding rooms as needed, teaching William and Samuel carpentry skills in the process. The river that had nearly claimed their lives became a place of family gatherings in summer, its banks offering shade and its waters providing relief from the Texas heat. Daniel taught all the children to swim, ensuring they would never fear the water that had once threatened them. Sometimes, standing on the porch of their home watching Daniel teach Joseph to ride or hearing the girls' laughter as they helped Elizabeth with the chickens, Della would touch the silver locket still hanging around her neck and marvel at the journey that had brought them here. The wagon overturning in the river had seemed like disaster, the end of all her careful plans. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far more precious than she could have imagined, a love that had saved not just their bodies from the water, but their hearts from loneliness and uncertainty. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Della back to the spot on the Red River where they had first met. The children stayed with Martha in town, giving them a rare day alone together. Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't happened to be riding by that day?" Daniel asked as they sat by the now peaceful river. Della leaned against his shoulder, secure in the circle of his arm. "I believe we were meant to find each other," she said. "Perhaps not in such dramatic circumstances, but I think our paths would have crossed somehow." Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple. "Well, I'm grateful it happened as it did, even though it nearly scared the life out of me to see you and the children in that river." "My hero," Della teased gently, though the words held genuine appreciation. "Not a hero," Daniel corrected, as he always did. "Just a man fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time, and even more fortunate that you agreed to marry him." As they rode home in the golden light of late afternoon, Della reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate widow struggling to save her children from the raging river, to the confident woman riding beside her husband toward their thriving home, the transformation seemed almost as miraculous as their rescue had been. Yet it wasn't a miracle, she knew. It was the result of courage, hard work, and a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings, a love as steady and true as the man who had ridden into the waters to save them all those years ago.